Welcome. I'm Tita Chico, Professor of English and Faculty Director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies at the University of Maryland. We convened this year-long series on anti-racism to act on the various statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter issued by the department, the college, and the university. We also convened this series to honor and highlight the long-standing commitment among many English department faculty and students to anti-racist scholarship and teaching. To be clear, anti-racism is not an add-on in this series. It is the intellectual starting point for humanistic literary inquiry. Anti-racism is also a practice that pushes us beyond the inadequacy of diversity and inclusion. As my colleague, Professor Zita Nunes writes, "This is not the time, if ever there was a time, for shifting over to make room, for being the one to allow others to speak, for making promises. This is the time for remaking who we are." George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black Lives Matter. Jacob Blake, Daniel Prude, Black Lives Matter. We are meeting virtually today, but we are grounded by our institutional home, the University of Maryland. Just last week, the university's Department of Women's Studies announced that it had renamed itself as the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, drawing on Tubman's legacy and commitment to liberation and justice. As we meet virtually today, grounded by our institutional home, we also celebrate the memory of Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, a young Black man who was about to graduate when, in 2017, he was killed by a white supremacist at a campus bus stop. Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, Black Lives Matter. We are meeting virtually today, but we are also grounded by the sedimented lands upon which the university stands. The university is on what is now known as the state of Maryland, but these grounds are the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. Today, we have the privilege to welcome Professors David Sterling Brown and Arthur Little for their conversation, Invisible Bondage, the other side of working on Shakespeare and race in the age of COVID-19. 4 years ago, my colleague, Professor Julius Fleming Jr., wrote, "Now I find myself a Black intellectual, writer, and freedom dreamer, asking a pivotal question. What does it mean to write Black in the age of Ferguson?" Today, September 8th, 2020, this is the question Professors Sterling Brown and Little pose. What does it mean to be in bondage to the work, tilling the field of Shakespeare studies in the age of COVID-19? How, they ask, in the oppressiveness of this historical moment, might anti-racist reflection enable one to distinguish between serving the work and letting the work serve? Today, September 8th, 2020, is also the time of the Scholars' Strike. We are proceeding with this event because the work of Professors Sterling Brown and Little shares the same racial justice and educational goals as the Scholars' Strike, which is a teach-in on police brutality, racism, and white supremacy. The Center's Anti-Racism series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries and by the Graduate School's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Today's event is also sponsored by the Perdue Foundation and the Marshall Grossman Lecture Series. With this support, we are able to commit to making these events accessible. Live captioning is available through the Typewell window, which has been included with the webinar link and is in the chat below. For those of you on Twitter, our hashtags for conversation are hashtag Antiracism UMD and hashtag CLCS_UMD. And please take a look at the events that we have scheduled for the rest of the year. Thank you to Daniel Griffin and Liam Daly, the Center's graduate assistants, and a special thanks to Dr. Karen Nelson, co-director of the Center and director of research. Our program will be 1 hour. Our guests will be in conversation for 30 minutes, after which my colleague David Carroll Simon and I will come back to moderate the Q&A. And we ask that you pose your questions in the Q&A. Now, please join me in welcoming Professors Sterling Brown and Little for Invisible Bondage, the other side of working on Shakespeare and race in the age of COVID. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Tita, for that introduction. I also want to thank your sponsors as well for putting this series together and inviting Arthur and I to be here today so that we can be in conversation with one another and talk about this important topic. I also want to say that I really appreciated the various moments throughout your introduction, Tita, where you called attention to Black Lives Matter. As I sit here as a Black scholar, as a Black Shakespearean, about to engage in conversation with another Black Shakespearean, it is not lost on me how significant it is that Arthur and I are able to actually be here right now in this moment. So thank you. And I also want to acknowledge that we are standing today, of course, as Tita said, in solidarity with the scholar strike, particularly as we think about how this conversation was born out of thoughts on violence. And so let's start there. There's sort of an inseparable, pervasive violence happening right now as I think about the work that we're doing, Arthur, both as scholars, but then also in terms of what we see happening in the streets, so to speak. You know, systemic racism is hyper visible, it's everywhere. It is inescapable, and we're seeing right now in various ways, not just with the use of gun violence as far as state-sanctioned violence is concerned, but also even with COVID-19 and the responses to that in terms of how that virus is impacting Black and Brown communities in this country. And so what I'm thinking right now, if you'll indulge me, is that we can really just kind of offer a behind the scenes look of, you know, what is it like to do this work in this particular moment right now when it is impossible to separate the real violence outside of our field from perhaps the fictional violence that we deal with inside of Shakespeare studies, but then we can also think about the metaphorical violence that happens, you know, among colleagues, et cetera. And what does it mean to do this work right now, particularly as Black academics? I think it would be really nice to illustrate how we get pushed and pulled and have to maneuver in different directions as we encounter daily the nuances really of racism.
No, I think that and also thank you, Tita and others, and of course, David, for engaging me and all of us in this conversation today. I think back to a conversation you and I had just a couple of weeks ago when we were doing our, you know, let's compare notes, let's talk about what it is we want to think about for today, and why is it that we find ourselves in the particular predicaments that we find ourselves in today. And if you remember, in the background was the ice cream truck. And the ice cream truck was playing that racist song that many of us now know, but has a sort of very problematic history and has some very scary lyrics. And that song, however, is attached to all of this nostalgia, innocence, childhood, ice cream. And so even after it has become known that the song is a racist song, that is our society, hasn't let go of it. And at that moment, it struck me what we are doing in some respects as Shakespeare scholars, or one of the predicaments we find ourselves in, I should say, as Shakespeare scholars. And that is particularly when I think about the classroom, or I think about trying to engage donors for various reasons, that one wants, or they expect often, this very anodyne version of Shakespeare, and so that we can go in and do a conversion of great books or something. And so that there's this nostalgia around Shakespeare that one is always contending with. And as Black Shakespeareans, it becomes difficult because one is always suspect. One is, what is it that you want to do here, right? Why are you here? Is a question that a number of us have gotten in different venues, institutional venues, in our careers. What are you doing here? What is it that you want, right? Why are you interloping into Shakespeare studies? Why aren't you doing Black studies? And that cuts in so many different ways. And one of the ways, to me, what strikes me that it cuts is that, and this almost is something I will ask Black Shakespeareans to forgive me for even as I say it, which is that, and I've actually found myself saying this to certain administrators types in the past, which is Black Shakespeareans actually love Shakespeare, right? And so it becomes this kind of cringe-worthy moment because one realizes that it becomes difficult to do one's research in an environment, in a climate where there is a particular set of beliefs that we're supposed to hold on to as we talk about, do research on Shakespeare, right? There's a certain kind of nostalgia. And just as with the ice cream song, that nostalgia is a antithetical one to many of our projects. It is also antithetical to what is actually going on in Shakespeare's works, right? We were asked to become, in a sense, to sign on to certain almost cultish beliefs about who or what Shakespeare is in our culture, rather than to carry out the research.
Well, and I think, so you said a lot there that I'm just like, I'm gonna grab it all up. No particular order here, but I love what you use the word cut there when you talk about it cuts deep. That makes me think about how I talk to my students on the very first day of class. There is this nostalgia for a particular kind of Shakespeare, for a particular kind of way of even receiving his plays. And that's one of the things that I have had to grapple with as a Shakespeare and race scholar over the years, because I realized, and I just tell the students directly, I don't do cookie cutter Shakespeare. So if that's what you're looking for, I may not be the best person for you in terms of teaching this work, because I do love Shakespeare. And I think you're absolutely right. When you said that Black academics, Black Shakespeareans, we love Shakespeare too. I think how we love Shakespeare is very, very different. And I think that particularity is what sometimes is a bit jarring for people. Like, you say you love Shakespeare, but you want to take his work and examine it in the context of how he's perpetuating ideas about sexual violence against Black men, for instance. That's okay, right? Like, Shakespeare put all of this there for us to use. And if we're thinking about this moment, to go back to what you were saying at the beginning, this is a moment in which we cannot escape the pervasiveness of racism, and particularly anti-Black racism. And so Shakespeare, as he did, he used so many different tools that were at his disposal to create the works that he created. I feel like we're doing that as well as scholars who study and grapple with his work.
Yes, of course. And and also thank you for all that. And I agree with you completely. And I think one of the the piece that I keep coming back to is, Toni Morrison in Playing in the Dark, talking about white literature so often, or critiques thereof, critiques thereof, is kind of lobotomizing the literature.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we, I think, start to appreciate as scholars of color in particular, since the 1980s at least, and forward, has been this lobotomizing of Shakespeare. But we're coming in from the outside, so to speak, right, in terms of the way this works institutionally. And so our voices about when we come in to say, yes, that a lot of dominant cultural criticism has lobotomized Shakespeare in the name of whiteness. For example, there is this kind of great pushback because of a certain kind of, because of a nostalgia around whiteness itself, right? And around whiteness as this kind of dominant objective force in the institution, which Shakespeare work continues to repeatedly deconstructs, right? And so one of the things, I know you were talking about Shakespeare and Black bodies, et cetera. One of the things I also think about is how Shakespeare is, one of the things I love about Shakespeare, I'll start there, is the way in which he resists caricature, or the way that language, I should say, caricatures, and the way that language can become so reductive, right? And one of the things we see from Shakespeare play to Shakespeare play is this struggle for Shakespeare against, and quote, this cautionary tale against the way language is so often not used just to sort of create us, but to destroy us. And a lot of that comes out of the way language can become, almost by definition, a reductive force. And one of the things we see then, when I would say, when scholars of color in particular, many of them working on questions of race or discourses of race, turn to Shakespeare and start to unpack all of that caricaturing, or sort of point it out, and to make Shakespeare, in that sense, more complex from a societal point. There's a push back against that work. And strangely enough, it is a kind of caricaturing caricaturing that is going on there, which is to say that, you've experienced this, I've experienced this as well, right? The sense of, oh, are you saying that Shakespeare is a racist? Are you saying, no. Are you saying that Shakespeare is an anti-racist? Hell no. Right? It's this way in which one is sort of being pulled, this attempt sort of to pull one into these reductive narratives, because those reductive narratives in the end can only serve certain kinds of institutional power, right? Yeah. And so that's where they want us as Black Shakespeareans. Right? Why are you here, right? What are you here to do, right? As though we sort of, we come in knowing that what we want to do is topple the statue of Shakespeare. And I, yes. Continue.
Well, when I think about, what am I here to do? That's a really great question. It's a big question. And it makes me think in part of how I have decided to, just pitch my own work and think about my own agenda with respect to always having an eye toward anti-racism. So when I see, for instance, the pushback that, we get it in our classrooms, we get it in the scholarship as well. But Shakespeare's work and the multifaceted nature of Shakespeare's work is what gives us the opportunities to do these kinds of things. I love what you just said there too about, is Shakespeare racist? I mean, that's not a question I know that you or I are interested in even answering, because I think
Black Shakespeareans who are, but continue.
Well, yeah, I know that, but I'm saying for you and I,
fair enough.
It's more about, what can we do with the racism that we see in the work, for instance. So I would never say that a play like Othello or a play like Titus Andronicus or Antony and Cleopatra does not contain racism.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they do. And it's about, for me, what can we do with those moments? How can we make them useful in the classroom? How can we make them useful in the research? And part of that leads me to sort of embed in my teaching, embed in my research, activism. I think that's a big part of doing anti-racist work is activism. I think that's one of the reasons why you and I are here today, is to sort of perpetuate the and activism that needs to be done, both in the field, but then also in academia at large. And I think that's why this umbrella of the scholar strike and that happening today is really significant, and given the conversation that you and I are having.
Yes, and just to iterate a point again that you just made, which is the anti-racism becomes in a way that you're talking about. Indeed, there's racism in a play like in Othello, or in Titus Andronicus, Antony Cleopatra, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that isn't the end of a conversation, right? That is the beginning of a conversation. Right. And to attempt to reduce the text to name calling, if you will, becomes a way, as I was trying to say before, of reducing the Shakespeare, the Black Shakespeare scholar, right, to a bit of sound bites, and so that the immense training, whether it's in pictorial arts or in classics, or in history or philosophy, that most of us, or critical race theory, that most of us bring to our work, some combination thereof, for example, gets sort of erased in this reductive way of approaching all this. And I think it's something that Ayanna Thompson has written, which she has argued that race is a capacious topic, and it deserves a capacious response, right? And one of the things that we know as race scholars is race isn't just sitting there as a thing in itself. It is very much sort of intertwined in rhetoric, as in humanist education, as Ian Smith would talk about. It is entwined in humanist education, as Eric de Barros would talk about. It is entwined in misogynistic racial discourse, as Kim Hall will talk about, right? It's enshrined in institutional bad faith, as Margot Hendricks will talk about. It is embedded in a history of white supremacy and white fragility, as critics from Peter Erickson to Justin Shaw will talk about, right? It is just to name a few, but it is this way again of trying not to have a conversation, so that it turns this back on to us as scholars. And because behind all of it, right? So we're talking about behind the scene, as you talked about earlier, because behind all of it is, with no other way to put it, is institutional racism, right? And that we're all, in a sense, just like talking about ice cream trucks and nostalgia or what have you, we're all so dealing with, as Black scholars, we are dealing with what a couple of, I think, recent educators have talked about as the NICE syndrome for Black faculty and other faculty of color at these institutions, where scholars are, in some ways, we know that we're being asked not to speak what it is we actually do know. And one of the things that seems so horrifying at times is, even with all the kind of acrobatics that I know many scholars of color in Shakespeare studies will do to keep from completely upsetting the apple cart, there is still this tremendous sort of pushback, and it is done in the name of kind of humanistic objectivity, whereas in fact, it is nothing short, in my estimate, of a humanistic violence. And to go back to something else that you said, I think the lie that is so current in academia is that humanistic violence is different from the violence that happens in the streets of America, right? That humanistic violence is different from what happens in Charlottesville, even though some of us may end up walking out of a department meeting feeling as though one has just been through a Charlottesville's experience with people with PhDs. Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking that happens often. It's something that when you were just talking, you brought up the word, we keep revisiting nostalgia. To me, I think to just put it succinctly, like the nostalgia is a lie. And I think that's something we need to grapple with as we move forward and continue thinking about Shakespeare, continue thinking about race. You didn't cite yourself, so I'll cite you and your list of citations there. The whiteness being linked to property, for instance, is something that you have introduced us to and got us thinking about. And it is so clear that the nostalgia for a specific kind of Shakespeare is both linked to, white people's ownership over this dramatist, over his work, over the history, but it's also Shakespeare aside. I mean, even if we just look at his characters, which they're not real, right? But yet people want to own a Hamlet, or people want to own a Desdemona. These become characters who are favorited, they're revered, or the plays are revered. And I can't help but wonder if part of that also is linked to this idea of nostalgia, how Desdemona, for instance, gives us a certain type of white womanhood, whereas Hamlet, for instance, gives us a certain type of white manhood that is linked to this kind of, introspection, intellectualism, that, again, another kind of identity that gets revered as we think about the academy even, what type of scholar would Hamlet be if he were one, for instance? He certainly wouldn't look like me. So there's that too. And I say that the nostalgia is a lie because it's only this thing that people choose to believe in. There are limits to that nostalgia, right? Like you can't go there because of who you are. And I can't go there with the nostalgia either because of who I am. That is not what Shakespeare represents for me. And so when I think about the conversations that we've been having and talking about, that term fun, for instance, keeps playing in the back of my mind because I don't get to have fun when I do this work. Not in the same way that that person who is nostalgic for Shakespeare because they just love how beautiful the language is and all that stuff. I don't necessarily get to do that. What I get to do with Shakespeare is very different because for me, this work, tying this back into this event, thinking about police brutality, street violence, metaphorical violence, it's all a part of my existence. And it is hard, as I said in the brief introduction there, to separate the violence from the violence.
Yes, and I think I want to pick up for just a moment when you're talking about fun, because I was thinking about queer theory, in particular, in that arena, the way in which one of the, of course, very serious and rigorous scholarship and all that. One of the things that is one of the hallmarks of queer theory is to have fun. And these critiques that are, they're clever. They're filled with wordplay. They're filled with innuendo, etc. And we are not allowed. Race. One can't do that. Race is we can say far more sociologically speaking, right? Is far more serious than all that. But again, language plays. And so to get sometimes at the thorny business of race, one needs to talk about how linguistic playing or cultural playing works. But it's not quite the same plane, it's not quite the same having fun that we could talk about under the rubric of queer theory. And, you know, it strikes me that the sense of just you're keeping the race conversation as contained as possible. And one of the, while I'm speaking of queer theory for a second, I will say that one of the big differences between sort of trying to do queer theory work, or queer studies work, and trying to do race work is it seems one of the directions of queer theory is, look, everybody is ultimately engaged in this, right? Everybody is, you're walking around thinking you have this kind of normative position or what have you. And one of the things that queer theory has been so useful in exposing is just how queer normativity is. And so everybody, in a sense, is at the party. For race, what we do is show how we're all implicated in race making in various ways, historically and in the present. And the push, again, from the academy and from a lot of our Shakespeare scholars who are not working in this arena is that's about Black people. And so that one can walk out of a talk where one says nothing about any of the Black characters in Shakespeare and get the response, oh, so you work on Othello. And it keeps coming sort of back to this notion that no, if you're talking about race, you really are just talking about Black people, and that has nothing to do with the rest of us.
Well, and that's, you know, the invisibility factor there, right? So we get to work in this field where, you know, the work is sometimes rendered invisible depending on who does it. So there's that, because you said something that I thought was really interesting there. You said that in comparison, you know, race work is kind of more, I'm paraphrasing, is more serious work on some level. And I know you don't mean it serious in terms of disciplines, but
of course not. Yes.
Yeah. And so, but sometimes that seriousness, the toll that this work takes, even that is invisible. And so for me, as we were, you know, getting this together, I was thinking about how that registers as part of this invisible bondage. Like we are locked in to something that we love, whether that's Shakespeare, doing race work, but at the same time, we do not have the freedom to operate in the ways that we might like to. You mentioned something, used the word landmines the other day, and how we're constantly having to navigate the field, dodging these landmines. And that's, I think, a really apt visual for me, because I sometimes I want to go this way. I just want to go straight. It's the fastest way to get there. It's the easiest way for me to do what I need to do. But then Jacob Blake happens, and then Breonna Taylor happens, and then there are these protests down the street, and there's these laws being changed, you know, these anti-Black laws. And so it's a lot, again, that takes us back to this idea of how separate, well, actually, we didn't ask that question before, but I'm going to ask it now. How separate is the street from the field, right? Like, for you, how separate is the street from the field?
For me, it isn't.
Okay.
Right. No, it isn't. Again, it's when I go back to a text I love from, I think it's from 1989, Stephanie Jedd's book, Citing, on the birth of humanism in Renaissance Florence. And, you know, in that phrase of hers, chaste thinking or chaste thought, is one that really characterizes kind of I would call it the grand humanist gesture, right? It is this notion of these compartments, this separating our lives into bits, into these bits and pieces. Here I am the person, over here I'm the professor, you know, here I'm teaching, here I'm the researcher. And it's convenient for us when we need to compartmentalize and focus on a particular point.
Yeah.
The way that I imagine to get way out of my area of expertise here, the way I would imagine in a lab that that one would isolate a particular problem in order to pick away at it in order to come back, before coming back to the larger story or what have you. So it's an important part of what we do. There are moments where I really do need to just worry about the year 1619, right? Where I really need to just to sit on that for a while before coming back out to say a larger story. But where we so often, I think, get it wrong is we take that gesture and we take that and we say, okay, let's then turn that into who or what it is that we do. Let's turn that into the thing itself. And that kind of disciplining, right, which is the love of humanists, right? That kind of disciplining is actually intellectually compromised in various ways, and it is also highly racialized.
Yeah.
And that's why we find ourselves here in these institutions about how, for example, to talk about the ways in which the humanities has some, something that Paul Gilroy has also talked about, the way the humanities has some very serious race problems. And how do we talk about those? How do we dissect those? How do we engage those without, again, sort of that shift that a lot of Black academics in humanities know, that shift so quickly, or response to that, to the sociological, right? And so at that moment it's, oh, so you're no longer in, you're in Shakespeare studies, you're in race studies. You're not in the humanities, you're in sociology. That's a sociological thing you're doing. And it's this way in which, and what they often don't see, something I'm trying to also talk about in another project on Hamlet and disciplines, that what they often don't see is all we're talking about there is capitulating to the discipline itself, right? Which becomes a form of the lobotomizing that Toni Morrison talks about, is that all we're doing in those instances is we're looking at the discipline that we've created and we're saying, oh, that's it, that's real. And it's like, no, that is only a discipline that has allowed us to create a certain kind of vocabulary to do certain kind of work, but don't forget that we have to go back to the larger project. And so often we don't. We commit ourselves to the discipline. We look in the mirror and we say, ah, there lies the truth. And the same way as we look in the mirror, or some, not me, I guess, look in the mirror and says, ah, my whiteness, ah, that's real, there's reality, there is the objective, the objective stance of the world. And again, it's like, no, right? And so trying to get inside the humanity in a way that, to get inside the humanities that allows us to explore the humanities and not to shift the story over to the sociological is really, really difficult business. And I would say finally that is, but it is Shakespeare so often in the academy, in the humanities, right, that sits, I hate this language, but I'll use it, who sits at ground zero in that conversation. It's Shakespeare who sits right at that moment where our modern sense of the human resides.
There's a slew of thank yous. The thank yous are coming in from the West Coast, Middle America, East Coast, and London.
Oh, well, thank you.
And just a whole big, huge slew of thank yous. And I want to thank both of our guests today for making visible the labor that is so deeply invisible. And thank you for your brilliance and spending time with us.
Thank you.
And yeah, the thank you. So you can see it in the chat. Thank you. So I also want to thank my colleague, David Carroll Simon, for helping moderate the Q&A, and Karen, Danielle, and Liam. So, but most of all to David Sterling Brown and Arthur Little I'm really grateful. Everyone, this will come, we'll post the first part of this on the web, and we'll also share some of the questions. There were lots of kind of juicy questions we weren't able to get to as well. But thank you. You guys are fantastic. All right. Thank you very much. All right.